So today we're going to talk about formalism. You read the introduction to the period in the textbook, and I know there's a lot of information in there, so my hope is that I can clarify and point out some key terms and ideas from what you read to help you achieve this overview of the beginning of literary theory. So to start, formalism itself, as you can see, began in the early 20th century. So there were thinkers prior to the people that we would call formalists that were interested in literary interpretation and critical analysis. However, this period, the beginning of the 20th century, the 1900s, this is when the new criticism and these Russian formalists, and as you have seen, the neo-Aristotelians, were labeling ideas, labeling methodologies in this way. So we mark this as the beginning of criticism in the academy, in the literary academy, in the school of thought. And these thinkers are identified often as modernist thinkers or modern writers, and they sought to, in some ways, purify criticism itself. So this thoughtful interaction with a text, these thinkers wanted to label and identify the ways in which to do it in the right way, to make it a pure practice. After 1960, this criticism began to be decentered, and the purifying focus or the organic unity, seeking an organic unity, was no longer as important. We'll talk a lot more about that as the class progresses. But just to help you to identify these three primary categories of formalist approaches to a text, I want to start with the Russian formalists, of course, and point out that they were rejecting these 19th century assumptions about literary works. So in particular, the primary assumption they were rejecting was that literature was an expression of the author's worldview. Now, an author and a text, they interact together, of course. However, Russian formalists were very concerned about what they saw as a mistake in linking the two, the meaning of the text and the author's background, too closely. So the Russian formalists dismissed, as a whole, they dismissed psychological and biological criticism, and you can see that Cleanth Brooks talks about that quite a bit in the assigned portion of the text that you had to read. And the Russian formalists also emphasized the autonomous nature of literature, that it could be its own organic entity. And then the Russian formalists were also very concerned that the proper study of literature is literature itself, to stick to the text itself. And again, Brooks mentions context. Brooks himself was a new critic, but you can see that Russian formalism led to the beginning of the new critic movement. So Russian formalists, as you can see as well here, that the regime of Stalin around 1930, unfortunately, silenced the work of these thinkers. But we are indebted to them in so many ways. They help us with this concept here that poetics and form go hand in hand. This analysis of a work's constituent parts or its form, these things are very important. The form itself includes internal mechanics, these devices, especially poetic language, and each device has a peculiar property that can be analyzed. This is very important to these thinkers. They were concerned with the literariness of a piece, and when you watch the video that you're to watch this week dealing with a poet, Elizabeth Alexander, she mentions this as well, that the language of a poem should be in some ways different from everyday language. This is a contrast to what Wordsworth taught us in the 19th century. But Russian formalists were fascinated by the fact that linguistic structures, grammar, these grammatical devices could be used for defamiliarization, to make strange the familiar. Our text says, "Art makes the world strange again," so that we can see it with the freshness of a child. And that word text for Russian formalists equals a unified collection of literary devices and conventions that can be objectively analyzed. Very important for what we are doing in this course. So the new critics believed that the poem itself contains all the necessary information to discover its meaning. So you can see that this is very influenced by the Russian formalist approach. And new critics, formalists in general, they're very intrigued by poetry as a whole, as a literary genre. It provides, I believe it provides for a formalist a smaller unified text that they can deal with so that they can unpack the meaning. The larger the work, the more difficult it is to be able to make meaning more concrete or simplified. So the new critics believed, like the Russian formalists, that a text is an autonomous object. It has ontological status. It has meaning and being on its own. It's like an organism. And then the new critics helped us with this concept of close reading or explication. I use this word, this phrase, a lot in my classes, and I hope you will embrace it, because it is what we ask you to do here at this university, is that you engage in close reading. The term originally was discussed as the phrase slow reading. So if you consider yourself to be a slow reader, that is not a bad thing. That means that you take the time to look at each of the particular elements of a text, to think about them, and to focus on how they work together here. So close reading and new criticism is really a form, for the new critics, it's really a form of exegesis. There are 4 different phrases I want you to just pay attention to here on this slide. The intentional fallacy, which as you read Wimsatt and Beardsley's piece, that will help you. The affective fallacy, that what the reader feels doesn't necessarily matter in a new critic's opinion. Not that it doesn't matter at all, but as far as determining the meaning of the work, it's not the most important piece. I've already been using this phrase organic unity quite a bit, but this was very important to the formalists, that every work has an achievable organic unity. And if it's a good work of literature, it will accomplish that in their minds. And then the heresy of paraphrase, which can be troubling for some. For the new critics, a poem was viewed as a bundle of harmonized tensions and resolved stresses. Its meaning then is not simply the sum of its parts, and so cannot be paraphrased. Not to say that paraphrase doesn't provide something for us, but it doesn't give us more meaning than the text itself. And then lastly, in our introduction, we learn about the neo-Aristotelian thinkers, or the Chicago Criticism. Clearly, these scholars were indebted to Aristotle's research and Aristotle's ideas specifically about plot and the plot structure. And I ask you to deal with that in the assignments for this week. But the new critics believed that the aesthetic experience, and again, discussing poetry, gives us a form of truth outside science. I love that our text identifies that the new critics were like disappointed priests, and that the Chicago critics were like displaced scientists, kind of merging of disciplines here. The neo-Aristotelian scholars use these 2 words, the eidos and synelon, shaping form in the concrete whole. Again, they were focusing on plot and plot's role as a literary device in order to arrive at a whole, a unified sense of meaning for a work. So plot, character, and thought give shape to language to create an object with the power to affect the reader in various ways. A little bit of a rub against the affective fallacy there. And then these neo-Aristotelians, most importantly, they employed a more scientific approach to literature, so hypotheses are tested until the best explanation is found. So you're starting to see perhaps even emerging away from arguing that there is one interpretive meaning for a text, and we are indebted to the Chicago critics for that. The neo-Aristotelians, they engaged in many attempts to restore plot to its former place of priority in fiction. So Cleanth Brooks focuses primarily on irony in the text that you read. He talks about paradox, ambiguity, and these tensions. So the Chicago School of Critics, they would emphasize an evaluation of the author's solutions to specific problems in the construction of a text. So bringing back the author, bringing the author into it, but really what the author is doing as he or she is using the tools of the trade to achieve a unified purpose. Many of these critics sought to redefine plot as movement, and some critics have even reverted to the position of Aristotle in giving it primary importance in fiction. They described plot as the author's control of the reader's emotional responses, his arousal of the reader's interest and anxiety, and the careful control of that anxiety over a duration of time. This really helps us as we begin to look at film as well as a text that we're able to analyze, because there is a similar kind of engagement occurring when you think about the filmic or cinematic elements of a film as they engage with the viewer's interest and anxiety and suspense in those ways. So there are a few steps, 7 steps for formalist analysis that it's useful for you to take a look at as you continue on in this week of reading literary works, fictional short stories, and some poetry, and you look at them as a formalist would. So you can look at 1, diction, allusions, images, symbols, and figures of speech. These are all literary devices. Start to identify any structural patterns that you see. Think about tone, theme, point of view, tensions, ambiguities, and paradox. And then lastly, it's your task to state the chief tension and the dominant effect that an author, you believe, is seeking to establish by using some of these parts. Perhaps 1 or 2 stand out most to you to achieve a whole. Thank you.